There is a type of person you've probably met at least once. Someone who doesn't collapse when criticized. Someone who doesn't spend 3 days replaying a difficult conversation. Someone who can sit with uncertainty without it slowly eating them alive. They're not cold. They're not pretending. They just seem to have built something solid inside. Something that doesn't shift every time the outside world pushes. Most people assume that's a personality trait, something you're either born with or you're not. But it isn't. It's a result of understanding something specific about how emotions actually work, where they come from, what they're really about, and why certain things hit harder than they should. What Carl Jung spent his life studying, and what the Stoics were pointing at from a completely different direction, is this: the outside world doesn't control you directly. It controls you through the unexamined parts of yourself. Through the wounds you haven't looked at. Through the needs you haven't admitted. Through the patterns running quietly in the background that you've never stopped to question. This episode is about those patterns. Not in an abstract way, in a practical, honest way. Because once you understand what's actually happening when something disturbs you, the disturbance starts to lose its grip. Not immediately, not perfectly, but genuinely. 1. Nothing affects you until it touches something unhealed. Think about the last time something small hit harder than it should have. A passing comment that stayed with you for days. A tone in someone's voice that triggered something you couldn't name. A moment of being overlooked that felt just for a second like something much bigger than being overlooked. From the outside, it looked like an overreaction. Maybe you even told yourself it was. But what was actually happening in that moment had nothing to do with the other person. The outside world didn't create the pain. It landed on something that was already there. This is one of the most honest observations about how human beings work. We are not disturbed by events. We are disturbed by the places inside us that events happen to touch. A comment only cuts deep when it confirms a fear you're already carrying. Criticism only destroys when some part of you secretly agrees with it. Rejection only devastates when your sense of worth was quietly resting on the person who just walked away. Most people respond to this by trying to control the outside, managing what people say, avoiding situations that feel risky, building walls against anything that might sting, and on the surface that seems reasonable. But what they're actually doing is protecting the wound without ever looking at it, which means the wound keeps running the show. Jung noticed that we each carry a map of sensitivities we didn't consciously choose. The person who was made to feel small for showing emotion grows into someone who cannot tolerate being seen as weak. The one who experienced early abandonment learns to need constant reassurance, and then resents themselves for needing it. These aren't character flaws. They're old adaptations that stopped being useful a long time ago, but never got updated. The shift begins not with suppressing the reaction, but with getting curious about it. When something hits harder than expected, instead of immediately defending yourself or distracting yourself, pause long enough to ask, what exactly just got touched? Was it your need to be respected? Your fear of being left behind? Your sense of being capable or worthy? The question itself begins to loosen the grip, because a wound you can name clearly has less power over you than one you only ever feel blindly. The world will keep sending difficult moments. That's not the problem. The problem is walking into every room carrying unexamined wounds and wondering why certain rooms keep hurting. If this is landing for you, leave a like. It helps this episode reach someone who might need it today. And stay with me, because the next point goes one layer deeper. 2. Your reaction is the doorway to your shadow. There's an idea Jung introduced that most people find interesting the first time they hear it, and then quietly avoid, because following it honestly requires looking at things that aren't comfortable to look at. He called it the shadow, not darkness in the dramatic sense, just the parts of yourself you learned, at some point, to hide, the emotions that got punished, the needs that felt too vulnerable to admit, the qualities that were unwelcome in the environments you grew up in. Over time, you pushed them down, not because they disappeared, but because keeping them visible felt too costly. Here's what makes this relevant to your daily life. The shadow doesn't stay hidden. It leaks. It shows up as the irritation you can't fully explain, the anger that feels slightly too large for the situation, the discomfort you feel around certain types of people that you can't quite justify rationally. And this is the part most people miss. The shadow doesn't announce itself as something unresolved inside you. It announces itself as a completely justified reaction to something outside you. You meet someone confident and feel an irritation that lingers longer than it should. You tell yourself they're arrogant. Maybe they are. But the intensity of the reaction, the way it stays with you, that's worth sitting with. Because what Jung observed is that we tend to be most reactive toward qualities in others that we've buried in ourselves. The person who was taught that ambition is shameful becomes quietly critical of ambitious people. The one who suppressed their anger becomes deeply unsettled when others express theirs openly. The individual who learned to hide their need for attention finds attention-seeking in others almost physically irritating. This isn't a flaw. It's just how the mind handles what it can't integrate. What changes everything is a simple but uncomfortable reframe. Your strongest reactions are information, not just about the other person, about you, about what's unresolved, about what part of your inner life is asking, through the irritation or the sudden sadness or the disproportionate anger, to finally be acknowledged. This is why Jung didn't treat the shadow as a problem to eliminate. He saw it as a resource waiting to be reclaimed. The anger you suppressed contains real boundaries and self-respect you've been living without. The ambition you buried contains genuine direction. The need you've been hiding, even from yourself, contains honest information about what actually matters to you. The practice is straightforward, even if it's not easy. When you feel a reaction that seems too strong for the situation, don't immediately act on it, and don't immediately suppress it. Just stay with it long enough to ask, what is this showing me about myself? Not about them, about you. That single shift changes your entire relationship with your emotional life. You stop being someone who is constantly at the mercy of what other people do, and start being someone who uses every disturbance as a pointer inward. The world doesn't become less difficult, but it becomes genuinely more useful. Every irritation becomes a question worth asking. Every strong reaction becomes a doorway. And slowly, the parts of yourself you've been avoiding stop controlling you from the dark, because you've finally turned the light on. If you're finding this useful, write the word shadow in the comments. It's a small reminder that self-knowledge is always closer than it seems. 3. The event is not the pain, the meaning you give it is. Two people receive the same criticism from the same person in the same room. One processes it, takes what's useful, and moves on by the end of the day. The other carries it for weeks, replaying the moment, feeling the sting of it fresh each time it resurfaces. The words were identical. The situation was identical, but the experience was completely different. This gap between the event and the suffering it produces is one of the most important things you can understand about your own emotional life. Because what generates the pain and determines how long it lasts is rarely the event itself. It's the meaning your mind assigns to it. Epictetus built an entire philosophy around this one observation. He wasn't dismissing suffering or telling people to toughen up. He was pointing at something structurally true: the same loss, the same rejection, the same failure. None of these carry a fixed emotional weight. They carry the weight of the interpretation placed on them. Marcus Aurelius came back to this constantly in his private journals, writings never meant to be read by anyone else, which is exactly why they feel so honest. He kept asking himself the same question in different forms. If I remove the story I'm telling about this situation, what actually remains? And the answer, more often than not, was something much smaller than the suffering suggested. Modern psychology arrived at the same place through research rather than philosophy. What they found is that the most significant factor in how distressing an event feels isn't the event itself. It's the rapid judgment the mind makes about what the event means. Does this mean I'm a failure? Does this confirm I'm not enough? Does this prove I was right to be afraid all along? The mind reaches for its existing beliefs and uses the event as evidence. And suddenly, something that could have been a minor difficulty becomes confirmation of a fear you've been carrying for years. This is where things get both harder and more freeing than most people expect. Because if the meaning is something you are generating, not something the event contains, then the meaning is something you can actually examine. When something hits hard, the honest question isn't, "Why did this happen to me?" It's, "What am I telling myself this means?" And that question, followed with real patience, often reveals something surprising. The criticism that felt devastating was being read as proof of unworthiness. But is it actually that? The silence from someone you care about was interpreted as rejection. But is it? The failure was processed as evidence that you should never have tried. But where did that conclusion come from? This isn't about rationalizing pain away or pretending difficult things don't matter. Some things genuinely hurt. Some losses are real. The point is narrower and more practical. Between the event and the suffering, there's always a layer of interpretation. And that layer, once you learn to see it, becomes something you can work with. The person who understands this stops being entirely at the mercy of what happens to them, not because they feel less, but because they develop the ability to separate what actually occurred from the story they immediately began telling about what it means. And in that small gap, there is more freedom than most people ever realize is available to them. 4. Stop making other people responsible for your inner state. There's a pattern so common it becomes invisible. Someone says something dismissive and the rest of your day is gone. A person you respect doesn't acknowledge your effort and you spend the evening replaying the moment. Someone is cold toward you without explanation, and suddenly your mood, your confidence, your entire internal weather shifts to match their behavior. It looks like sensitivity or caring deeply, but underneath it, something more structural is happening. You've quietly handed another person the controls to your interior life. And most of the time, you don't realize you've done it until the damage is already there. Blame is how this transfer of power becomes permanent. When you locate the source of your emotional state entirely outside yourself, in what they said, in what they did, you're not just describing a cause, you're placing your emotional recovery in their hands as well, which means you can only feel better when they apologize, when they change, when they finally understand what they did. And most of the time, none of those things happen on your schedule. This isn't an argument against accountability. People do cause harm. Some behavior deserves to be named and responded to directly. But there's a real difference between holding someone responsible for their actions and making your inner peace conditional on their response. The first is healthy. The second is a quiet form of imprisonment that can look from the inside like justified anger. Epictetus kept returning to one simple distinction: some things are within your control and some things are not. Other people's behavior falls firmly in the second category: their words, their moods, their decisions about how to treat you. None of these are yours to govern. What is always yours is how you respond, not just staying calm on the surface, but not allowing someone else's behavior to become the governing force of your internal experience. Jung approached this from a different angle. He noticed that when we depend on others for our sense of stability, when we need their approval to feel worthy, their attention to feel seen, their validation to feel capable, we're not really in a relationship with them. We're in a relationship with our own unmet needs, and we've cast them in the role of the person responsible for meeting those needs, which places an impossible weight on every relationship and guarantees a particular kind of recurring disappointment. The move away from this isn't hardness. It's not about caring less or closing yourself off. It's something more honest, learning to locate the source of your stability inside yourself rather than inside the behavior of people around you. It starts with a simple shift in attention. The next time your mood changes dramatically in response to something someone else does, instead of following the emotion outward toward them, follow it inward. What just changed? What need just went unmet? What fear just got confirmed? Moving the attention from them to you is exactly where the actual work is. Over time, this changes the texture of your emotional life, not because people become more reliable, they won't, but because your internal state gradually stops being a weather system controlled entirely by what's happening outside. You become someone who can be affected by things without being defined by them. That's a different kind of freedom than most people are looking for, but it's the only kind that actually holds. 5. Release the illusion that life must obey you. There's a particular kind of suffering that doesn't come from loss or failure in the obvious sense. It comes from expectation, the quiet, often unconscious belief that things should unfold a certain way, that people should behave according to a certain standard, that life owes you a particular kind of order and predictability. And when reality fails to meet that expectation, the result isn't just disappointment. It feels like a personal violation. The tricky part is that the expectation is usually invisible until it's broken. You don't walk around consciously thinking, "This person must never disappoint me." The expectation lives below the surface, silent and certain, until the moment reality contradicts it. And then it announces itself as pain. Epictetus was direct about this. He didn't say that wanting things is wrong. He said that directing your need for peace toward things outside your control is the architecture of suffering, not as a philosophical abstraction, as a practical observation about how human beings actually function. A person whose stability depends on circumstances behaving a certain way will spend enormous energy trying to manage the outside world, because the alternative, feeling what happens when it doesn't cooperate, is too uncomfortable to sit with. Marcus Aurelius lived this in an unusually direct way. He ran an empire, which means he spent decades watching carefully laid plans fall apart, watching people he trusted disappoint him, watching events go sideways despite his best preparation. And what his private writing reveals is someone genuinely working day by day on separating his effort from his need for the outcome to obey him. He acted fully. He just stopped requiring the results to validate the effort. That distinction is more useful than it sounds in daily life. The person who needs their partner to always understand them will experience every misunderstanding as a small crisis. The one who needs their work to always be recognized will feel diminished every time it isn't. The individual who needs uncertainty to resolve quickly will live in a state of low-grade anxiety for most of their adult life, because uncertainty isn't a temporary condition that eventually ends. It's the permanent texture of being alive. What makes this hard to work with is that the need for control often disguises itself as reasonable expectation. It's not unreasonable to want kindness. It's not unreasonable to want your efforts noticed. The problem isn't the wanting, it's the rigidity underneath it. The part that has quietly decided that if things don't go this particular way, something has gone fundamentally wrong. The release isn't resignation. It's not becoming indifferent or giving up on things mattering. It's something closer to loosening the grip, recognizing the difference between genuinely engaging with life and exhausting yourself trying to make life behave. And in the space created by releasing that second project, something steadier becomes available. Not certainty, not the guarantee that things will go well, just the quiet capacity to remain present with what's actually happening without needing it to be something else first. If this episode is giving you something useful, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next, because the second half of this conversation goes even deeper. 6. Become the observer before you become the reaction. There's a moment, very brief, easy to miss, that exists between something happening and your response to it. Most people never notice it. The trigger arrives, the emotion rises, and the reaction follows so quickly that the whole sequence feels like one single event. Someone says something sharp, and you're already defensive before you've consciously registered what happened. Something goes wrong, and the anxiety is already spreading before you've had a chance to assess whether it actually deserves that much weight. The gap between trigger and response collapses, and a surprising amount of life gets determined inside that collapsed gap. Relationships get damaged in it. Words get spoken in it that take weeks to undo. Decisions get made in it that have nothing to do with the actual situation and everything to do with an older, more familiar pain. What both ancient philosophy and modern psychology agree on is that the gap can be widened. Not perfectly, not permanently, but meaningfully. And widening it might be the single most practical thing you can do for your emotional life, because everything else we've talked about in this episode requires it first. You cannot examine a reaction you are already fully inside of. Epictetus described this as the one freedom that cannot be taken from you, regardless of what's happening outside. You may not control what arrives, but you always have some say in what you do with it. That pause, however small, is where your actual agency lives. But this isn't primarily an intellectual exercise. It's not about analyzing your way out of an emotion midstream. It's about something simpler and harder, learning to feel the emotion rising without immediately becoming it. Think of it as developing an inner witness, a part of you that can notice, "I'm angry right now," rather than simply being the anger. A part that can observe, "Something in me wants to shut down completely," without immediately shutting down. It creates just enough distance between the experience and the experiencer to allow for something other than pure reflex. Jung saw this capacity as central to psychological maturity. The person entirely identified with their emotional states, who is the anger, who is the anxiety, who is the excitement, has no perspective on those states at all. They're moved by whatever arises, like someone caught in a current with nothing to hold on to. Developing the observer doesn't mean feeling less. It means feeling fully, but from a position that isn't completely swept away by what you feel. In ordinary life, this looks quieter than it sounds. It's the breath taken before replying to something that stings. It's noticing mid-anxiety that your mind is running a familiar catastrophic story, and the small but significant choice to watch the story rather than treat it as fact. It's the moment of recognizing, I'm about to say something I'll regret, before you say it. The practice builds slowly, through repetition. There's no point at which you become permanently above reflex. But the ratio shifts. More moments of pause, fewer moments of pure reaction. A growing familiarity with what your emotional patterns actually look like from the inside, before they fully express themselves on the outside. And that shift, modest as it sounds, changes a great deal. Because a person who can observe their reactions before becoming them is no longer entirely at the mercy of whatever the world sends their way. They retain something real. Not control over events, but genuine authorship over response, which, in the end, is the only form of control that was ever actually available. 7. Stop feeding the false self that needs approval. There's a version of you that was built for other people. It developed gradually, probably early, in response to what got rewarded and what got ignored. It learned which qualities made people comfortable and which ones created friction. It learned how to present, how to perform, how to manage impressions. And over time, it became so familiar that most people stopped noticing it's a performance at all. Jung called this the persona, the mask we wear in public life. And he was careful to say it isn't inherently a problem. Some degree of social adaptation is just how human beings function together. The problem begins when the mask becomes the identity. When you start believing that the version of you that needs to be liked, respected, and approved of is the real you, and that any threat to that version is a threat to your actual existence. This is where approval becomes a vulnerability rather than just a preference. When your sense of self is tied to how others see you, every interaction carries more weight than it should. A compliment becomes evidence that you're okay. Criticism becomes evidence that you're not. Someone's indifference feels like a verdict. Someone's disagreement feels like rejection. You're not just navigating a social situation anymore. You're constantly managing a fragile internal structure that depends on external input to stay upright. And the exhausting part is how invisible this is from the inside. It doesn't feel like fragility. It feels like caring about quality, or having standards, or being a thoughtful person. But underneath the reasonable explanations, there's something more exposed. A self that cannot afford to be disliked, cannot afford to be dismissed, cannot afford to be seen as anything less than it needs to be seen as. The people who are hardest to manipulate, hardest to destabilize, hardest to provoke, they've largely solved this problem. Not by becoming indifferent to others, but by building their sense of self on something that doesn't require constant external confirmation. Their identity doesn't live in other people's opinions of them, which means other people's opinions, while perhaps noted, don't have structural power over how they feel about themselves. This isn't arrogance, it's actually the opposite. Arrogance is an overcorrection. It's the fragile self pretending to be invulnerable. What we're talking about is something quieter, a groundedness that doesn't need to announce itself because it isn't performing for anyone. The practical question is simple, but worth sitting with honestly. Where in your life are you making decisions about what to say, what to share, what to pursue, what to avoid, based on how it will be received rather than what you actually think or value? Because every time you shrink something true about yourself to avoid discomfort in someone else, you feed the false self and starve the real one. and a self that has been starved long enough becomes genuinely hard to locate, even for the person it belongs to. The work here isn't dramatic. It's small and consistent, saying the honest thing when the agreeable thing would have been easier, pursuing something that matters to you without announcing it first to see how people react, letting someone's disapproval land without immediately trying to fix it or explain it away. Each of these small moments is a vote for the self that doesn't need permission to exist, and over time, that self becomes the one you actually live from. 8. Train emotional immunity through discomfort. There's a common misunderstanding about what it means to become emotionally strong. Most people imagine it as a kind of natural toughness, something you either have or you don't. Or they imagine it as the result of enough positive thinking, enough self-belief, enough reassurance that everything will be okay. But emotional stability isn't built through comfort. It's built through the repeated experience of discomfort that doesn't destroy you. This is how the nervous system actually works. When you avoid something that makes you anxious, the anxiety doesn't decrease, it grows. The avoidance teaches your system that the thing was genuinely dangerous, which makes it feel more threatening the next time it appears. Over time, the circle of what feels safe gets smaller and smaller, not because the world became more threatening, but because you trained your nervous system to treat discomfort as a signal to escape. The reverse is also true. When you stay with discomfort, when you let criticism land without immediately defending yourself, when you sit with uncertainty without immediately reaching for distraction, when you face rejection without withdrawing from everything that could lead to it again, you teach your system something different. That discomfort is survivable, that it passes, that you are more capable of handling difficulty than the anxious part of your mind keeps insisting. This isn't about forcing yourself through pain for the sake of it. It's about recognizing that the things you consistently avoid are quietly running your life. The person who never sits with criticism becomes permanently dependent on praise. The one who always escapes uncertainty never develops the capacity to function inside it. The individual who avoids rejection at all costs builds a life shaped entirely around that avoidance, smaller, safer, and somehow still anxious, because the fear never got tested. The Stoics practiced this deliberately. They called it voluntary discomfort, intentionally choosing difficulty not because life required it, but to prove to themselves that they could handle it. Seneca would periodically live as though he had nothing, eating plainly, dressing simply, not as punishment, but as training. He wanted to know from direct experience that the loss of comfort wouldn't break him, and knowing that changed his relationship with comfort entirely. He could enjoy it without needing it. The same principle applies to emotional exposure. You don't become less sensitive to criticism by avoiding it. You become less sensitive by receiving it, processing it, taking what's useful, discarding what isn't, and discovering that your sense of self remained intact through the whole thing. You don't become less afraid of rejection by never risking it. You become less afraid by risking it, experiencing it, surviving it, and updating your internal model of what rejection actually costs. Each time you do this, the emotional threshold shifts slightly. What used to feel intolerable starts to feel manageable. What used to derail you for days starts to pass in hours. Not because you've become numb, you haven't, but because you've accumulated genuine evidence that you can handle more than you thought. This is what emotional immunity actually looks like. Not the absence of feeling, but the confidence, earned through experience, not assumed, that whatever arrives, you will not be destroyed by it. 9. Turn every trigger into a mirror. There's a particular kind of person who irritates you in a way that's hard to explain. Not someone who has genuinely wronged you, just someone whose presence, whose way of speaking, whose confidence or neediness or carelessness activates something in you that feels disproportionate to what they actually did. You probably have at least one person like this in your life right now. The natural response is to focus on them, to analyze what's wrong with them, why they behave the way they do, why other people don't seem as bothered as you are, and sometimes that analysis is partially correct. But the more honest and more useful question isn't about them at all. It's about why them, why this quality in this person produces this particular reaction in you. Jung observed something precise here. The things that disturb us most in others are often the things we haven't fully made peace with in ourselves. Not always, but often enough that the pattern is worth taking seriously. The quality that irritates you in someone else is frequently something you either suppressed in yourself, were punished for expressing, or secretly fear you embody without wanting to admit it. The person whose arrogance drives you to distraction, is there an ambition or confidence in yourself that you've learned to keep quiet? The individual whose neediness exhausts you, is there a part of you that has similar needs but has been hiding them for so long they feel shameful? The one whose carelessness infuriates you, is there a version of that freedom somewhere inside you that never got permission to exist? This isn't a way of dismissing legitimate frustration. Some behavior genuinely deserves a clear response, but the intensity of the reaction, the part that lingers, the part that feels slightly obsessive, the part that keeps pulling your attention back, that intensity is information, and the question it's pointing toward is always inward. The practice here is one of the simplest and most uncomfortable in this entire episode. When someone triggers a strong reaction, before doing anything else, ask honestly, what is this showing me about myself? Not what is wrong with them. What is this revealing about something unresolved, unexamined, or unacknowledged in me? Sometimes the answer is nothing significant. Sometimes the irritation really is just about them. But if you ask the question consistently and honestly, you'll start to notice patterns. The same quality keeps bothering you across different people. The same type of situation keeps producing the same disproportionate response. And those patterns are a map, pointing directly at the places where your self-knowledge is still incomplete. This reframe changes the entire experience of conflict and irritation. Instead of being drained by difficult people, you start extracting something useful from the encounter. Not because they deserve credit for disturbing you, but because the disturbance itself, followed honestly inward, keeps returning pieces of yourself that you didn't know were missing. Every trigger becomes a question worth asking. Every difficult person becomes, unintentionally, a contributor to your self-understanding. And slowly, as you recover more of what was buried, the triggers lose their charge. Because the unresolved material they were pointing at no longer needs an external event to make itself known. 10. Master your perception and you master your reality. Everything we've covered in this episode points toward one place. Not a technique, not a rule, not a philosophy you adopt intellectually and then set aside. A fundamental shift in how you relate to your own inner life. When you understand that your triggers point to unhealed places, you stop being blindsided by your own reactions. When you recognize that strong emotions reveal what's unexamined rather than just what's unfair, you stop wasting energy on the wrong question. When you separate the event from the meaning you assign it, you discover that the same world can feel entirely different depending on where you're standing inside yourself. This is what perception mastery actually means. Not positive thinking, not pretending difficult things aren't difficult. It's the ability to meet what's happening without the layers of old wounds, unexamined assumptions, and inherited fears distorting everything you see. The Stoics called this clarity of judgment. Jung called it individuation, the long process of becoming more fully yourself by integrating rather than suppressing what lives inside you. Different languages, same territory. A person who has done this work doesn't need the world to behave a certain way to remain steady. They've built something inside that doesn't depend on outside conditions to stay upright. This doesn't mean nothing affects you. Things will still land. Loss will still hurt. Difficult people will still be difficult. But there's a difference between being affected and being controlled, between feeling something and being consumed by it, between noticing a reaction and being entirely at its mercy. That difference is what this episode has been about, and it's built gradually through honest self-examination, through the willingness to look at what your reactions are actually telling you, through the slow process of recovering the parts of yourself you learned to hide. Nobody becomes psychologically untouchable overnight, but every honest moment of self-inquiry moves you slightly further from being controlled by what you haven't examined, and slightly closer to the kind of inner stability that doesn't need perfect circumstances to exist. The person you were thinking of at the beginning of this episode, the one who seems unmoved, steady, hard to rattle, they didn't get there by feeling less. They got there by understanding more about themselves, about their reactions, about the difference between what's actually happening and what their mind is adding to it. That understanding is available to anyone willing to look honestly inward, not once, but as an ongoing practice, not perfectly, but consistently enough that the patterns slowly change. If this episode gave you something worth keeping, subscribe and continue with the playlist in front of you now. The next episode continues exactly where this one leaves off. Write mirror in the comments if something in this episode made you see yourself differently. It's a small thing, but sometimes naming the shift is how it becomes real.